So to quickly summarize, the last 3 chapters we studied some important definitions, but we haven't really learned anything about the working of the economy, the macroeconomy. So from now on, we will begin to address such important things as a recession or a depression, and what the government and the Federal Reserve Bank can do to help an economy climb out of recession. And you may be aware that our own economy, the US economy, has only recently emerged from what has been called the Great Recession, correct? It began around 2008 or so, and we've now come out of it. And unemployment rates at the present time are very low, right? So what we are going to now spend time doing is, first we will try to understand exactly what brings about a recession. Okay. And then we will look at the role of the government and the Fed meaning the Federal Reserve Bank, in helping economies climb out of recession. So we are now going to revisit some terms that we have already seen these terms before in the last few lectures. Potential GDP and the natural unemployment rate. Now, does anyone recall what potential GDP is and what the natural unemployment rate is? Anyone? You've just taken an exam. This should be pretty fresh in your minds. Exactly. Potential GDP is also called full employment real GDP. It's the level of GDP at which there is full employment in the economy. Now, what's meant by full employment? When do we have full employment in the economy? Somebody? When would you say there is full employment? When the entire labor force is employed? Can that ever be? No, right? Why can't it be? Because there will always be what kind of unemployment? Frictional and structural, exactly. So when do we have full employment then? We have full employment when everyone in the labor force is employed except whom? Except the naturally unemployed. Because these guys will always be there, as we've discussed. Right? Who are the frictionally unemployed? Can you give me an example of a frictionally unemployed worker? Now, this will be someone like you upon graduation. The moment you graduate, you will have skills that are in demand, right? But it will still take you some time to find a job. And why will it take you some time to find a job? Because of imperfect information. Correct? You know there is a job out there for you, for your skill set. But it will take you some time to find that job, right? And just as it's going to take some time for that employer to find you, right? And in that interim, you are going to be unemployed, frictionally unemployed. And that kind of unemployment is always going to be there, even at the best of times, correct? So when do we have full employment? When the only unemployed, in other words, are the naturally unemployed. So the unemployment rate then is, at full employment, is going to be what? Well, if the only unemployed workers are the naturally unemployed, then the unemployment rate in the economy must be equal to the natural rate of unemployment. Isn't that what the natural rate of unemployment is? Right? And what is the natural rate of unemployment in the States? Any thoughts? 4 to 6%. Exactly. People believe closer to 4 than 6. Right? So when the unemployment rate falls to about 4%, we know that we're at full employment. So we're going to look at some details about these two terms now, potential GDP and the natural unemployment rate. You know what these are, but we're just going to spend some time just delving into these things a bit deeper. Okay? So here is our definition of potential GDP, which you already know. It's the value of real GDP produced when there is full employment in the economy. says, recall that the unemployment rate equals the natural unemployment rate at full employment. That is, there is no cyclical unemployment. The only unemployed are the frictionally and structurally unemployed. Okay? Our symbol for potential GDP shall be Y with a little sub F. And that F stands for full employment. Okay? Now here we have a production function of real GDP. And what is a production function of real GDP? It says here it's a relationship between labor employed and the output of real GDP. So really this is an input-output relationship. What's the input? The input is labor. Well, actually, it isn't just labor. Really, we have, as you know, we have 4 types of inputs in the economy. Can anyone name them quickly? The 4 types of inputs, meaning raw materials, meaning resources. Come on. You know the 4 resources. Labor is one of them. Yes, that's what I'm going for. Land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. These are the 4 resources. Is that correct? Now, this production function looks only at the relationship between labor and the output being real GDP. So this is an input-output relationship. Labor is the input and the output is real GDP. Now, why are we focused only on labor and not on capital, not on entrepreneurship, not on land? What about these? Well, the argument here is that at any point in time, these are fixed in quantity. There is a fixed amount of land at any point in time. There is a fixed amount of entrepreneurial talent. And there is a fixed amount of machinery, capital. What is variable here is the labor. Labor is variable. Now, why is labor variable? You might say that, well, the quantity of workers in the economy is fixed at any time. You might say that. But labor isn't the quantity of workers. It isn't the quantity of human beings out there. Labor is really the amount of labor hours that workers choose to work. Now that's a personal choice, you see, right? So what labor is not just people, it is labor hours. And labor hours is determined by the individual worker's choice to work. How many hours should I work, for instance? That's my choice, am I correct? If I choose to work longer hours, then I will be supplying to the market, to the labor market, a larger quantity of labor hours. Do you follow me? So the idea here is that labor, which is labor hours, is nothing that isn't fixed. It isn't fixed. Whereas capital, entrepreneurial talent, and land are fixed. Right? Since they are fixed, we can keep them out of the picture. They are in the background. And so you have this relationship then between labor and the level of GDP that labor produces. And that relationship is described by this graph that you see to the right. So what is this? This is the production function. That's the production function, or PF. It's a relationship between the input of labor, so this is the input of labor, and that here is the output of real GDP. Is that understood? Now what about the other resources of capital, entrepreneurial talent, and land? Where are they? Can they be shown in this diagram? No, they're not. They are behind the scenes. So behind the scenes are capital, entrepreneurial talent, and land. They are behind the scenes. They can't be shown in this diagram. They are fixed in quantity at any point in time. Right? Now, what do you notice about this production function? You notice that there is a positive relationship between the input of labor and the output of real GDP. Meaning, when no labor is employed, which is going to be right there at the origin of the graph, what's the amount of real GDP produced? 0. So no labor equals no output. On the other hand, if you increase labor to 100 billion hours per year, then we end up producing, according to this graph, we end up producing $10 trillion of real GDP. Right? So when you go from 0 to 100, what's the increase in real GDP? The increase in real GDP is, you go from 0 to $10 trillion. So that's the change in real GDP when you go from 0 labor hours to 100 billion labor hours. Now, when you go from 100 to 200, on the other hand, when you go from 100 to 200, what is the increase in the output of the economy? Do we have the same $10 trillion increase, according to this graph? No, right? The increase now is going to be that much, you see? $5 trillion. So what's the point being made here? The first 100 billion labor hours seem to be more productive than the second billion, or rather the second 100 billion labor hours. First 100 was more productive than the second 100. What about the third 100? If you go to the third 100, well, that seems to have about the same productivity level as the second 100, right? You go from B to, no, hang on, no, it's smaller, because this is the output level produced by 200 labor hours, right? And with 300 labor hours, you produce, hang on, I misread the graph. Let me correct myself, okay, hang on. The first 100 billion hours give you $10 trillion of GDP, but the second 100 doesn't give you 5, rather it gives you less, right? Okay, let me just correct myself. This is the contribution of the second 100. Is that right? And that's smaller than the contribution of the first 100. This is the contribution of the first 100. Now, what about the contribution of the third 100? Now, that would be the difference between, this would be the contribution of the third 100. And if you eyeball it, it looks a bit smaller than the contribution of the second 100. Correct? So what's happening here is that the productivity of labor seems to be decreasing as you use more and more labor. Right? In other words, the way we express this formally is we say that there are diminishing returns to labor. There are diminishing returns to labor. Labor becomes less and less productive as you use more and more of it. And what might be the reason for that, intuitively?
Skill level of your laborers.
Well, that's a possibility. So you're saying that in the beginning you're using the more skilled workers and later on you're using the less skilled ones. That's a possibility. But really the main argument here is that these workers are working with a fixed amount of the other resources being capital, land, and entrepreneurial talent. Now, when you combine more and more of a variable input with a fixed quantity of the fixed input, something has got to give eventually. That's the idea. You follow me? As you keep increasing your labor use, but your amount of the other three resources is constant, labor has to become, eventually has to become less productive. That's the idea. Now you can think about that in terms of a single factory, right? And you might, using a small factory with a fixed size, you could increase the output of that factory by packing more workers into that factory, right? So you put more laborers you put more labor into the factory, into the fixed quantity of machinery, you get more output. You run 2 shifts maybe, correct? But as you start to do more and more of this, as you start to pack the factory even more with workers eventually, there will be too many workers in that little factory. They will be jostling each other and interrupting each other's work. You follow me? And productivity is then bound to decline. Am I making sense? So there are limits to what you can do with the labor, given that you have a fixed quantity of the other resources. And that really is behind this diminishing returns to labor that we see here. Is that making sense? So this graph here is not a straight line. It's a curved line, correct? Had this graph been a straight line, if the graph had been a straight line like that, would we have had diminishing returns to labor? Would the second 100 billion hours have been less productive than the first billion, you think? If the line had been straight? They would be the same, exactly. Right? So if the curve had been a straight line, we would not have seen this diminishing returns to labor. Right? And because we have a curve that's like this, on the other hand, we have this diminishing returns to labor. Now, how would you describe that curvature? Now, remember, we've dealt with curvature when we discussed the production possibilities frontier. Correct? The PPF. Now, what was the shape of the PPF? How would you describe the shape of the PPF? A word. I don't need a shape. I don't need a gesture. Give me the vocabulary for it. Concave, precisely. Concave. Right? How would you describe this line? Would this be concave as well? Remember, you're always at the origin. This is where you are located. That's where you're standing, at the origin. And you're looking you're looking this way. How does a curve look to you? Concave, isn't it? So this too is a concave curve. Right? It's concave to the origin. All right. The next thing that I'm going to do now is look at the labor market. So once again, all we're doing here is we're delving a little more deeply into the terms potential GDP and the natural rate of unemployment. We have now dealt with that production function for real GDP, which is an input-output relationship. The input being labor and the output being real GDP. There are diminishing returns to labor there, as you saw. Now we're going to look at the labor market. And in any market, as you well know, there is quantity on that axis, on the horizontal axis. We have price on the vertical axis. We have a market demand curve like this, and we have a market supply curve like that. Now that's something that applies universally to all competitive markets, correct? But now we are going to look at the labor market, right? So in the labor market, what would be the quantity then? Well, that would be the quantity of labor, measured again in labor hours. So we might measure this in, say, billions of labor hours or even single labor hours, if you like. Now, what is the price going to be? The wage, exactly, right? But we're going to go a little beyond just the wage. We are going to call this the real wage. Now, do you remember the term real wage? What is the distinction between nominal wage and real wage? Do you remember this? Now, we did this when we were reviewing for your exam. How do you convert nominal to real, somebody? Real is always equal to nominal times 100 divided by the CPI. We are aware of that, correct? But all we do here is we convert this multiplication into a division, in which case we have to flip this fraction around. Correct? This thing here, CPI divided by 100, I'm going to call the price level, or P. So what do I have here then by this last expression? What do I have? I have real wage is equal to the nominal wage divided by the price level. Is that correct? Did you understand this fully? So what is the price level again? It's the consumer price index divided by 100. Yes? So on the price axis, I shall measure real wage. Why do I have real wage and not nominal wage on the vertical axis? The reason is that, as I've mentioned before, what matters to workers in terms of their wage is not the money wage they receive, it's actually what they can do with it. What can you buy with it is what's important to the worker. Is that correct? So to both workers and firms, nominal wages are not important. What is important is the real wage, because the real wage measures the actual purchasing power of money. You follow me? Money itself is just paper, right? What you can do with it is what matters to you and to the firm. Hence, we have real wage measured along the vertical axis. And so what do we have here? And here we have a demand curve for labor. So this is the labor demand curve. Now, who demands labor? Firms. So firms demand labor. So this curve here describes the behavior of businesses, right? And what do you see here? What's happening here? We see that as the real wage drops, what happens to the quantity of labor demanded by businesses? Goes up. Is that correct? Because we have a movement like this along the demand curve. So when the real wage is $80, firms buy about 100 billion hours of labor. If the wage were to fall to $50, firms would increase their quantity demanded of labor from 100 billion hours to 200 billion hours. Right? So what's the point being made here? As labor becomes cheaper in real terms, it stands to reason that businesses will hire more workers or more labor hours. Does that make sense? If a resource becomes cheaper, the business will use more of it. Right? So this is the labor demand curve in this labor market. Now we're going to look at the labor supply curve. Okay, so this here is the labor supply curve. And who supplies labor? Workers or households. So this curve here describes the behavior of workers. And what do you see happening here? We see here that as the real wage rises, the quantity supplied of labor increases. And this makes perfect sense from the point of view of an individual, correct? If you receive a higher wage, you're likely to work longer hours. You see, because we have a choice. We make a choice, and what's our choice? The choice is between labor and leisure. Now this gives us pleasure. Leisure is something we enjoy, am I correct? Labor, on the other hand, is never quite pleasurable, but although as a professor I can tell you that I enjoy my labor, but it may not be true of everyone. Am I correct? Now, so what will entice the worker to give up the pleasure of leisure to work? Has to be the real wage, correct? So the higher the real wage, the more likely workers are to give up leisure for work that pays them then. Is that correct? Hence, we have this positively sloped labor supply curve. Now, we are going to next bring these two together here in this labor market. So here's your labor demand curve, and here is your labor supply curve. And you bring them together, and of course, in a competitive market, we arrive at equilibrium where the two curves intersect, and this is where we have equilibrium in this labor market. And so what's the equilibrium real wage then in this diagram? The equilibrium real wage is $50. What kind of dollars are these? So, in other words, this is based on what year being the base year? What's the implicit base year here? Come on. 2005. Because real dollars are always base year dollars. We know that, am I correct? Now, since this is being expressed in 2005 dollars, 2005 must be the base year then, right? So that's our equilibrium real wage. And what's the equilibrium quantity of labor? The equilibrium quantity of labor happens to be 200 billion labor hours. So that's the equilibrium quantity of labor. So that's equilibrium in this labor market. So what would you say about this equilibrium? At a wage rate of $50, the quantity supplied of labor is equal to the quantity demanded of labor. Am I correct? In other words, according to this diagram, at equilibrium what happens? Everyone who wishes to work finds a job. Is that right? Isn't that the significance of that equilibrium? QS equals QD. QS is what? That's the number of hours that people wish to work. QD is what? It's the number of labor hours that firms wish to employ. And you have an exact balance between the two, an exact equality between the two. So in other words, everyone who wishes to work has found a job, in a sense. Correct? However, the real story is not quite that. Everyone who wants a job has found one. Is that true? That's what the diagram would suggest, correct? But that's not quite true. Why isn't it quite true? Because we have forgotten about one little category of unemployment, which exists even here. And what is that? The naturally unemployed. These guys, remember, will always be there. Now, consider a frictionally unemployed worker, okay? So let's say this market is in equilibrium. The wage is $50. And at that wage, the number of jobs that firms advertise is equal to the number of workers or labor hours that wish to fill those jobs. How would you, in that story, how would you bring in that frictionally unemployed worker? Let's say this person is a nurse. Nursing skills are on high demand in this economy, correct? And this is a nurse who has decided to move from Brownsville to Houston. Now, when she arrives in Houston, she's not going to get a job right away. She has to look for one, am I correct? And in that interim period, she is going to be frictionally unemployed. Now, can you square that with this story here? Yes, we can. See, you have to now think about, in this scenario, there are some workers who, well, there are jobs out there for them. There is a vacancy out there for this nurse, but it takes her a while to find that vacancy because of a lack of information. We don't have perfect information in this economy, correct? So even at that equilibrium, we do have some unemployed workers, and they are the naturally unemployed. So even though, according to this diagram, everyone who wishes to work has a job, that's not strictly speaking true, because there are some workers there who want a job but haven't yet found it. And so these workers are engaging in some job search. Correct? Now, we are going to talk about full employment. See, it says here, labor market equilibrium as full employment. So when do we have full employment? We have full employment now, and this is a new way to look at full employment. We have full employment when there is equilibrium in the labor market, by which is meant that everyone who wishes to work has a job, except for the naturally unemployed. So the only unemployed in this story then, the only unemployed when there is labor market equilibrium, the only unemployed are whom? The naturally unemployed. Everyone else who wishes to work has a job. That is labor market equilibrium. Is that correct? So we can clearly now associate full employment with labor market equilibrium. Right? If the only unemployed are the naturally unemployed, we know that means that there is full employment in the economy. Is that correct? So labor market equilibrium then is a situation of full employment then. Yes? And now we are going to bring the two diagrams together. Which two diagrams? This one, which relates the input of labor to the output of real GDP. We're going to relate this to this diagram. We're going to bring both together. And in order to do this, I'm going to depart from these slides and go to my drawing board. Okay? This is going to be my input-output diagram. So here I have labor, and here I have real GDP. Y is my symbol, has been my symbol for GDP, correct? Now, what is this curve going to look like? Sort of like that. Is that correct? Concave to the origin, as we know. There are diminishing returns to labor, as we've learned. Right? And exactly below this, I'm going to draw my diagram for the labor market. So here again, we have labor measured along the horizontal axis. And on the vertical axis, we have the real wage. W is the wage. That's the real wage, which is the nominal wage divided by the price level, as we've learned, correct? So the real wage is equal to the nominal wage divided by the price level. And in this diagram, we have a labor demand curve that looks like this, and a labor supply curve that looks like that. This is labor demand, this is labor supply. So where do we have equilibrium in this market? We have equilibrium where the two curves intersect, right there, correct? And this is going to give us the equilibrium real wage and the equilibrium amount of employment in the economy. The equilibrium amount of labor, in other words. Correct? Next, what we are going to do here is we are going to project this upward to the other diagram. So once again, this here is L star. What is L star again? L star is equilibrium labor, or you can call it equilibrium employment in the economy. Right? So therefore, this here is also then L star. So both horizontal axes are the labor axis after all, correct? Then what we can do is, from here, we can go sideways like that, and that will give us a certain amount of real GDP, correct? And tell me, students, what is that level of real GDP? Somebody. So that's the level of real GDP when there is full employment in the economy. Is that correct? What do we call that? potential real GDP. Exactly. This level of GDP here is potential GDP, also called full employment real GDP, denoted by the symbol YF. Do we see that? So this now gives us a relationship between L star, which is employment when there is full employment in the economy. That's how we've defined full employment, correct? So when do we arrive at full employment in the economy? When the labor market is in equilibrium. And that amount of labor then is the input in the other diagram, which generates a level of output equal to YF. So the two diagrams can hence be related to each other. And now we can start to talk about things that jog this in some way, some event that changes things here. And let's talk about that a little bit. Okay? Well, quickly, what would happen here if, let's say, American workers became more educated? With greater education, what do you think would happen in this set of diagrams? In other words, we have more skilled workers, more productive workers. Now, with more productive workers, there's going to be a change in the upper diagram. And what is that change going to be? Well, the change is going to be like this. Oopsie daisy. What's happened there? This means now that for any level of input, labor, the output of real GDP is bigger than before. And this comes from the fact that American workers have become more skilled, more productive. Correct? Will this also cause some change in the lower diagram, do you think? American workers becoming more skilled. Yes, it will, because it will now make workers more attractive to businesses. For any level of real wage now, the firm will hire more workers. Why is that? Why do you think firms will hire more workers for any given real wage? You see, the firm's making a calculation in its head. It's saying, okay, well, I hire the worker, I pay him W dollars, but how much work can I get out of him? How much can he produce for me? Do you follow me? There is a balance there that there is a calculation there that the firm makes. If the worker is worth more than what is being paid him, that's when he's hired. Am I making sense? Now, if the worker becomes more productive, wouldn't he be more attractive then to businesses at any given level of real wage? Because you're still paying him that old real wage, but now he makes more for you than he used to. He's worth more. That would make him more attractive, and so you'd like to hire more people like him. Is that making sense? So therefore, in this diagram here, the lower diagram, we expect a change also. And the demand curve that you see here will shift like this to the right. Correct? So we would end up with a larger amount of equilibrium employment, and that would also then translate to a higher level of potential GDP. Yes? So we can talk about things like that. Now, another change could be, let's say there's war in the Middle East, and this causes an oil shortage in the States. Oil, now what category of resource would that be now? Labor, land, entrepreneurship, capital. Where does oil fall? No. Land. Land is all natural resources, including oil. So with a reduction in the amount of land then, what is going to happen in this diagram? Well, the opposite of what happened here. Instead of the production function shifting upward, like I've shown here from the red to the from the black to the red in the upper diagram, The red now will be below the black. Do you see what I'm saying? The relationship between input and output will now be depressed somewhat because of the shortage of this crucial input energy, oil. And the labor demand curve should shift leftwards. Okay, so there are some questions in your homework, in your MyConLab homework that deal with these types of issues. Okay. And the last couple of minutes that I have here, I'm going to quickly look at natural unemployment, and I've already, in a sense, spoken about this. And so what determines the amount of, or the number of naturally unemployed workers? Well, here are the three factors that affect the number of naturally unemployed workers, and therefore the natural rate of unemployment. First, the pace of demographic change. We've dealt with this before, but I'll quickly tell you. If you have a country in which there is a very high birth rate, lots of babies being born, now that is going to lead to a population that is becoming younger. So a few years down the line, all those babies will become high school graduates and college graduates. So every year, we'll have a large number of new entrants into the labor force. Lots of new job searchers. Now, these are people with skills. They will have graduated college, they will have skills. But since there'll be such a large pool of them looking for work, you will have a very large number of frictionally unemployed workers. And that's going to bump up the natural rate of unemployment. So a young population usually translates to a higher rate of natural unemployment. Right? Second, the generosity of unemployment benefits. If the government is very generous in its unemployment benefits to job searchers are likely to prolong their job search. They will become more choosy, and they will choose to look for work for a long time, as opposed to giving them less generous benefits, in which case they will become desperate quickly and grab the first job that comes their way. Correct? Now, in many Western European countries, you have very generous unemployment benefits. You can draw almost your last wage for years on end. And that's why in countries like France and Germany, typically you have higher rates of unemployment than in the States. Because you have all these job searchers who are, in a sense, being coddled by their governments. Right? And they can afford to, engage in a kind of casual, not so desperate job search. Lastly, the pace of structural change. If you have an economy in which there is a lot of structural change happening, which means that many sectors of the economy are quickly dying because of changing patterns of international comparative advantage, for instance. Now, that is an economy in which there will be a large number of structurally unemployed workers. Right? And that too will then bump up the natural rate of unemployment. So these are factors that influence the natural rate of unemployment. And with that, I think I am done with this chapter. Okay? Stop here today. As I said, I will tabulate your grades just now. Okay?